This is not an ordinary sermon, an ordinary Sunday, and I'm not the ordinary minister here, nor am I trying out to be, so I can say pretty much whatever I want. But thanks to the elders for letting me fill in when Jeffrey's gone. Thanks to the worship team. It is not beyond me. I recognize that the worship leadership team allowed the service to be such that I had enough time so that if I do run a little bit long, and I'm thankful for that. I recognize that. I'm also thankful for some of my favorite people, Wade Dawson, Season Dawson, Matt and Chelsea Cole. Literally, my favorite people are here. By the way, Erin's down sick today, so she's not, but my other favorite people are here. So notice that nobody's watching my kids. I'm going to leave that to y'all. It was ancient Indian philosophers in the 8th century BC that first thought through the reductionist mindset that everything that is could be reduced to minuscule particulate matter, and ultimately nothing really exists. This reductionist philosophy was something that I believe you could easily reach as a conclusion. For instance, a cart is not merely a cart, but an assembly of its parts. There is an axle, there is wheels, there is a yoke, there might be a buggy basket of sorts. And even then, you could break it down into its constituent parts. Look at the wheel. The wheel is made up of a hub, spokes, and a rim. And the spoke can be similarly broken down into its constituent parts, and on down the rabbit hole you go until all you are left with are these minuscule specks. And these ancient 8th century Indian philosophers would say that ultimately everything is made up of those specks, and therefore there is nothing. Everything is indistinguishable. What then is anything if not a collection and assembly of those specks? About 400 years later, Democritus, an ancient Grecian philosopher, and his contemporaries would ponder this thought. And they would coin the term atomos to describe this centuries later as an uncuttable thing. Democritus's atom, as it would later become called, was thought to be that minuscule speck, a solid sphere of matter that is minuscule, uncuttable, indivisible, and ultimately made up everything that is life. When scientists over 2,000 years took the reins in the search for this fundamental perspective, it was in the 1800s. Notice Democritus in 450-ish BC. It was the 1800s AD that ultimately scientists would discover the atom. It was John Dalton, a scientist who studied the differences between chemical compounds. And in studying this, he concluded that these chemical compounds were ultimately comprised of indivisible building blocks that related to the elements that made them up. For instance, methane was made up of carbon and hydrogen. Therefore, he concluded indivisible atoms of carbon and indivisible atoms of hydrogen. Nitrous oxide would have been made up of indivisible atoms of nitrogen and individual atoms of oxygen and so forth. So what Democritus proposed around 450 BC, Dalton illustrated over 2,000 years later. However, the naming of these building blocks, atoms, was premature. Atomos meaning uncuttable. As it would turn out, atoms, as you know, were not uncuttable, but made up of their own constituent parts. It was J.J. Thomson in the second half of the late 1800s, where he discovered the first of the atom's constituent parts that you know of as the electron. From there, researchers began to scramble to understand the notion that these atoms, these minuscule specks, were not indivisible, but rather made up of their own building blocks. Where atoms were initially thought to be solid spheres tightly bunched together, the electron meant that there was more to be discovered. Experimenting in the early 1900s, radioactive particles were shot at a thin sheet of gold foil, just a handful of atoms thick, very thin gold foil, to learn that sometimes these radioactive particles were reflected and sometimes they passed straight through. It was then posited by these scientists that the shape of an atom was not a solid sphere, but it was more like one where these negatively charged electrons orbited the positively charged nucleus like planets orbiting the sun. There, it was discovered, much like our solar system, that most of the mass of an atom was discovered to be contained within the nucleus of that atom. The reason radioactive particles pass right through? Atoms are made up of almost completely empty space. As a matter of fact, if it happened to be that you held up a nucleus the size of an atom, the electron orbiting that nucleus would be over a half of a mile away. Atoms are made up of almost completely empty space. Fast forward to the 1930s, and the nucleus was deconstructed even more. There, it was discovered that evidence showed it to be composed of positively charged protons and electrically neutral neutrons. So you've got the mass of the proton and neutron and the orbiting electron now making up this atomic model. Note, this is not to scale. Experiments that followed involved firing some of those neutrons at a variety of elements, leading to the discovery of fission and the invention of some of the most destructive weapons that have ever been conceived. By the 1940s, we understood these elementary particles to be baryons, there will be a quiz later, and leptons. Baryons would include the protons and neutrons, and the leptons would be the electrons and such. And it was understood that these baryons and leptons could explain virtually everything that was made up of matter. But this would not be the end. There were still mysteries in the cosmos that could not be explained with merely baryons and leptons. Had we truly reached the end of the line, or would there be yet still another step down and even more rungs on the ladder? And following the atomic age of 1945, scientists would probe even deeper to find out. Particle physics over the next several years it moved very quickly as improved technology allowed researchers and experiments to discover a number of additional particles. By the 1960s, there was what they called a particle zoo. There were as many as 80 constituent particles that had been named. At that point, there was not so much the need to search for more elementary particles, but figure out what in the world these are doing. Why are they the way that they are? If you're looking at the slide, those with mass were grouped collectively as hadrons. That'll come up later and then again in the quiz. In 1964, there's a gentleman by the name of Murray Gell-Mann. He later won the Nobel Prize in 1969. In 1964, he was working on his theory of elementary particles and ultimately speculated that these hadrons, didn't want to do this, but those hadrons, to include protons and neutrons, would further be broken down into more of these smaller constituent parts that he called quarks, almost trying to be funny. And so the atom, which was later divisible to show a nucleus with supposedly orbiting electrons, the nucleus could be reduced into its constituent parts of protons and neutrons, which could be broken down into their constituent parts called quarks. And like the rudimentary experiments of firing particles in the early 1900s, by the 1960s, scientists were using massive particle accelerators to smash electrons, protons, and neutrons together to see what came out. And these experiments, this is an early particle accelerator, these experiments showed that hadrons were no less indivisible than the atom was once thought, but in fact were made up of these quarks, hence Gell-Mann's Nobel Prize. For the decades that followed, physicists smashed together these quarks, these elementary particles from every possible angle. Maybe you've heard of the Large Hadron Collider. That's why hadron is of any significance. Large Hadron Collider at CERN. Next several slides show the Large Hadron Collider. It sits over 500 feet below ground. It is a 17-mile tunnel underground in the border of France and Switzerland. It is the world's largest machine and the most extensive and expensive science experiment ever made. Over $9 billion have been poured into this, with over 100 countries, 10,000 or more scientists from all over the world coming together, spending all that money to answer these lingering questions. What are quarks? How many are there? How do they interact together? This is not working. And how do they form matter? Now, if you look at this on Google Maps, you won't actually see that ring because it's 500 feet or so underground. But it's amazing, a 17-mile circle. And for scale, that's a person on that lift. And they're trying to answer these questions by smashing particles together. For more than 50 years, they've been smashing particles together, these scientists. Not all there, but these scientists have been smashing particles together, and they've discovered a total of 6 fundamental quarks. There is not so much as a hint, they would say, that those quarks are made up of any constituent parts, that they have reached the bottom rung of the ladder. As far as particles with mass are concerned, quarks are at the bottom. They are as unsplittable as they get. In addition to the 6 quarks that make up baryons, leptons, in green on the slide, come up in a variety of 6, one of which is the negatively charged particle that you're familiar with, called the electron. These 12 particles on your left side of the screen make up everything that is matter. And with the discovery of 4 more force-carrying particles, the bosons in red, and the Higgs boson in yellow, which is said to give mass to those particles, the standard model of particle physics is done. It is finally complete. There is not another rung of the ladder below what you see on the screen. Modern physicist and atheist Sean Carroll says, when it comes to the laws of physics underlying everyday life, baseballs, tables, viruses, and human beings, we are done. It's quarks and leptons with mass from the Higgs field interacting with gravity, electromagnetism, and the nuclear forces. That's it. That's it. So where's God? Where does God fit into this standard model of particle physics? In the early 1800s, Pierre-Simon Laplace, a French mathematician, a scholar working on celestial mechanics, a contemporary of Newton, effectively studying why the planets orbit the way that they do and the moons around the planets and so on and so forth. That's celestial mechanics. Studying that, Napoleon once asked Laplace, where does God fit into your mathematical equations on how things work? To which he famously replied, "Sir, I have no need for that hypothesis." For hundreds of years in modern science, it's balanced by religious persuasion. And there has existed this tension in the balance of science and religion, such that religious people would allege that God fills in the gaps. And as scientific discoveries are made, Where our knowledge lacks, there is God. And it became known as this fallacy called God of the gaps. That is, anytime science could not answer a question, those who are religious in the room would default back to, well, that's where God is. And the further scientists would push that frontier and answer more and more questions, the further back God got pushed, and therefore God of the gaps became a derogatory saying. Even Isaac Newton, the brilliant scientist, who was able to describe the forces of nature and the movement of the planets hundreds of years ago, he is quoted as attributing God as the reason that the stars and the planets do not all fall in upon themselves as a result of gravity, as if to say that they would except God, as if God of the gaps. But our God is not a God of the gaps. You see, even Newton saw what many fail to see today. And I hope you've been thinking it all along the way as I've been talking about this in what seems to be a science lecture. As we've looked at the evolution of the standard model of particle physics, there is design in literally every bit of this. And with design comes first a designer. Even Newton wasn't arguing for a God of the gaps. Newton would say this most elegant system of the sun, planets, and comets could not have arisen without the design and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Big Bang cosmologists believe that they can explain the universe in four forces: electromagnetism, the strong and weak nuclear forces, and gravity. The four forces and the standard model of particle physics can explain everything that ever was or is or ever will be, and the atheists among them say they would have no need for deity as a hypothesis. When confronted and asked, well, what happened before the Big Bang? They say, we don't know. Those who would be filling the gap would say, well, then there was God. And they cry foul. God of the gaps fallacy. Neil deGrasse Tyson, famous modern cultural theoretical physicist, would say, we've got our best people working on that. But in fact, the fact of the matter is this. In the beginning, God created. If you believe that, what's on the screen behind me and to my left and in front of me, if you believe that, you don't believe in a God of the gaps. You believe in a God of creation. You believe in a God who created both particles and physics. You see, there's a war going on. And as I've studied this, it's my opinion that there's been a war going on for a couple hundreds of years of modern science between that which is natural and that which is supernatural. There's been a war going on, and it still persists, between the Bible and science as if they were to conflict with one another, as in they are diametrically opposed, and you have to choose one or the other. And it's perhaps, at least anecdotally, why most scientists are not believers. Why fewer believers go into the sciences. And perhaps why it's hard to convert those who find meaning behind the scientific explanations that are offered. It's why many Bible believers often reject science, perceiving that it has to be one or the other. It's my opinion that we are in danger of raising our young people in the Christian church, teaching the Bible as if it were contradictory to science. Because then they go to college where there are professionally trained educators who captivate their attention and explain to them what is behind the curtain of science in a very convincing way, and perhaps might lead them to denounce what we read in the Bible. But there should be no such war. The Bible and science are not mutually exclusive. In the days of the Bible writings, there was no distinction between the natural and the supernatural. God was at work. There was no such thing as divine intervention because God was always there. When you read Romans 1, you often turn to Romans 1 and verse 20. Since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes, His eternal power and divine nature have been clearly seen, being understood through what has been made, so that they are without excuse. I'm going to read that important part again. Since the creation of the world, His invisible attributes and eternal power, His divine nature has been clearly seen. There's no such thing as divine intervention, as if to say that God is not acting to hold the world and all of its creation together, and then now chooses to intervene. But now there is this war. You see, we often turn to the Bible and try to read into it, in my opinion, a little too much, and think the Bible is, to some degree, a science book. There have been times when we've tried to extract science from the Bible, perhaps to support its divine origin as a contention, seeing that it's evidenced by scientific knowledge that they wouldn't have had at the time. For instance, Isaiah 40 references the circle of the earth, and 2 Samuel 22, Psalm 8, the channels of the sea. But people have known for years, ages, that the earth is a sphere and the ocean has currents. The Bible never purports itself to be a science book. It's never purported itself to its intended audience that it should be read or understood as a science textbook, but rather, I believe that the Bible should be read the way that it was intended to be read, and understood as the audience was intended to understand it. So, for instance, when you study Genesis, and we could, for instance, about any number of texts, but when you, for instance, study Genesis, you're reading what Moses wrote to the Jewish people during their 40-year wandering in the wilderness journey to the Sinai Peninsula. Moses didn't witness the events of Genesis, but as an inspired author, penned a writing themed with creation, fall, sin, recreation, and how God's purposes would be fulfilled through Abraham's descendants. And with that in mind, thinking, for instance, of the audience who for 400 years had been in Egypt. And being in Egypt, the generation of people who were brought out of Egyptian captivity, they had only ever known Egypt, Egyptian culture, and perhaps their own heritage as retold generation after generation, but surrounded by polytheism in Egypt, they would have received this writing of Moses. And with that in mind, you've got to think that it's not by accident that Genesis was written the way that it was, to whom it was written. Where we, as modern thinkers, we want to, in our era of scientific revolution, in the era of modern scientific understanding, want to go back and read that with our own biases and our own mindset. We want to ask how. We want to understand the mechanism of creation. We want to figure out, how does that standard model of particle physics fit within the fact that God created? How did this happen? And we ask these questions. And so we read, in the beginning, God, and we ask when, how, what? Tell me more. I used to get wrapped up in the debate of young earth versus old earth creation, for instance. And for those who don't know of this, in the young earth creation model, we would believe that it is a literal interpretation we should take of Genesis. One day is one 24-hour day, and therefore we can calculate the earth, the age of the earth, based on the genealogies, that it is roughly 6,000 to 10,000 years old. And some take a very cemented position in that. For instance, Ken Ham, in his book, The Lie, Evolution, Millions of Years, He would say, believing in a relatively young earth, i.e. only a few thousand years old, is a consequence of accepting the authority of the Word of God over fallible man's word. Still, Christians, old earth creationists, believe that perhaps the age of the earth is much older, some hundreds of thousands of years and some billions of years. You might have heard of the day-age theory, where in an attempt to reconcile a literal divine material creation with the physical world we see around us, which appears to be much older than 10,000 years, there's an interpretation of Genesis that one day is actually an epoch or a geological age. Then there is the gap theory, which tries to reconcile Bible and science by inserting a huge gap between Genesis 1:1 and Genesis 1:2. Some, for instance, who espouse this position believe Genesis 1:1 refers to the cosmic creation event. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. He created everything. Big gap, Genesis 1 and verse 2, much later when He formed the earth. Then there is John Walton, whose take is that the ancients focused not on material nature, but how things functioned or how they were purposed, interpreting the creation story to be, from a literary perspective, mythology or poetry, wherein the writings describe how God purposed creation to serve as His cosmic temple, rather than describing literal formation. And he concludes that Genesis does not show creation's material origin, but its function, or the origin of its function and its purpose, purporting that God is the ultimate creator. Genesis just doesn't describe that. I wish I had more answers. I have a lot of questions. I hope I'm giving you a lot of questions. I'm not even telling you what position I take on some of these questions. I love the pursuit of knowledge. I love the learning along the way. I love the questions themselves, like, when was in the beginning? I don't know. But I know who was there. When you get to John 1:1 in the New Testament, you're still not reading a science book. But it reads, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through Him, and apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. In Him was the life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it. I don't know when, I don't know how, but I know who. You see, John 1:1 tells me that all things came into being through Him. And apart from Him, nothing came into being that has come into being. I don't believe that phraseology in the beginning, from Genesis 1 and John 1, I don't believe that's a coincidence. Because whenever in the beginning was, Jesus was there. And whatever creation looked like, nothing that was created without being created by Jesus. Jesus, who was the light of men, was there when God said, "Let there be light." Hebrews 11:1-3. This came to me when Jeffrey was preaching last Sunday and used some of this. Faith is the certainty of things hoped for, a proof of things not seen. Maybe a verse translation, the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. For by it, by faith, the people of old gained approval. By faith we understand that the world has been created by the Word of God, so that what is seen has not been made out of things that are visible. So here's the mind-blowing point to me. By faith, we understand that the world has been created by the Word of God, so that what is seen has been made out of things that are unseen. It doesn't say by scientific exploration. It doesn't say by discovery. It doesn't say by experimentation or by utilization of the scientific method we can hereby prove that creation was of God, but it says by faith we understand that the world has been created by God. If particle physicists were able to show by the standard model of particle physics and the four forces, the four fundamental forces and how they interact with the particles that create mass and the leptons, if they could prove where God fits into that model, it would cease to be true that by faith we understand the world has been created by God. But it's by faith we understand that God created in the beginning. It was the 8th century philosophers of India that perceived you could reduce everything to its constituent parts, and that we are all made up of these minuscule grains of dust. It was thousands of years later, modern particle physicists have identified those minuscule components and even given them names. But it was God who created quarks and leptons. It was God who created bosons and the four fundamental forces. It was God who is ultimately responsible for both material creation and John Walton ordaining it for its purposes. It was God who breathed life into those minuscule particles. It was God who called those particles to serve Him. It was God, the God of particle physics, the God of quantum field theory, and the God of creation, God our Father, who gave His only begotten Son, that whoever believes in Him wouldn't perish but have everlasting life. It is that God who created. And that's one question that I can answer. We've been designed by God, and God is the great designer. And He might have created us from particle physics, but He breathed life into us. And here we are, particles contemplating particles. Where you fall in the debate of science and religion, or in interpreting Genesis, where you stand on creation, where you perceive the Bible and science to be in conflict or harmony, I can tell you this: as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. We will serve the Lord. My daughters, Emily and Eliza, we will serve the Lord. Aaron, we will serve the Lord. I hope this lesson has been encouraging to you. Find the concreteness of your faith in knowing and trusting by faith that God is the creator of all, and serve Him. If there's a reason you might feel compelled to come forward today, this morning, you're welcome to do so as together we stand and as we sing.